Hi, and welcome to Real Trail Talk. I am Donovan D'Souza from The Long Ways Better.
And I'm Mark Pybus from The Life of Pi. Welcome to episode 94. It's a Don and Mark pod, and we're here to discuss what makes a good trail experience, or just what makes a trail good.
Yeah.
So this is one we've been meaning to do for quite a while now, but it's kind of been spurred on a little bit by some not so great trail experiences in the last year or so.
Yeah.
And also with the WA hiking strategy being released and kind of coming into its element where stuff should be built. We'll kind of have a discussion on trails and what we want to see in them and what we've experienced over the last decade.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So we'll try not to rant. That's really the main point. And we've got a bit of a structure to follow as we go through. And for Eastern States listeners, we'll kind of, being WA based, we're going off our experiences over here. Obviously, you may have different opinions based on the type of trails that you get to hike.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that it's sort of applicable nationwide, but yeah, I mean, there's probably some shortfalls in some areas here that maybe are not problems in other states.
Yeah, or like we get excited by things a bit too much over here, whereas they're kind of common fodder for trails in Tasmania or New South Wales and whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so we'll get started with bad trail experiences. We'll get this one off the bat first. So this is mainly me and a couple of experiences I had last year and this year as well. So if you listen to the year in review pod, you would have heard my rant about the Wilmanbillia, and I had a bit of not a rant, but a feedback on the new Nyanbiddy trail that was recently opened in Dwelling Up. So mainly vehicle tracks is what I'm talking about here. Donovan will be with me having done the first bit of the Wilmanbillia.
Yeah. I think the key thing here is the reason these trails have been built recently have been to create loop walks that create a multi-day experience that's near a town. So it's sort of about creating this very convenience-based infrastructure so people can do multi-days, because I think the feedback that Western Australia has been getting a lot of is, if you look at, Eastern States, in New South Wales, they're building a ridiculous amount of sort of great walk multi-days. Queensland has them. Whether they're great or not is a different question, but they have them. Tasmania has them. And we have one. We have the Cape to Cape, really, and some overnights. Like in Fitzgerald River. And
I mean, if you break the Billman down into week-long sections, you can kind of classify a couple of those as...
Yeah, a couple of them are sort of like, they would be as good as one of those, but they kind of feel that, long trails are sort of a different beast in a sense, but that's probably for a later part of this conversation. But yeah, I mean, we're definitely seeing that there's a lack of these trails. People are screaming for them. But is what we're building really the answer? From what we've seen, maybe not.
Yeah. But hopefully, I mean, there's room for improvement and also more investment. So maybe this will be the start. Maybe they'll invest more money. Who knows? But yeah, as I said, it's just the start of implementing this WA hiking strategy document.
Yeah.
All right, so we thought we'd start off with why have a trail? That's the big key is...
Yeah, why it exists anyway.
Yeah, why do they exist? Well, I guess the answer to that is they've existed for millennia, tens of thousands of years. If people needed to get somewhere, it was easier to have a trail that you knew for navigation purposes.
Yeah.
But recreationally, I think trails... They do serve a lot of purposes. The main one being kind of showing people where all the good sites are, because you won't necessarily know if you're not an experienced bushwalker reading maps or going out bush bashing all the time.
Yeah.
What the good areas are or how to get to a waterfall or a nice lookout or something like that.
Yeah. I really think that the key thing here is, obviously with every hike there's extrinsic factors. Like you could meet people who are awesome. You could have really crappy weather. You could have, really terrible things like an evacuation because of a bushfire, as has sometimes happened on the Bibbulmun. But the key thing here is that for most of the intrinsic factors, it's a curated experience. It's taking you from point A to B to C that is hopefully worth your time. And I think that you can see that in trails that are well sort of formulated as an experience. The ones that are sort of the world-class destination trails all have that. And they might be different in how they're presented because they're different. Like a coastal trail versus an alpine trail will be different.
Yeah.
But there's something about it that is, I think that they always have this commonality of having a good purpose for why you're going to places.
Yeah. And also environmentally, having a trail there, it squeezes people into the one space. Because as we found out with off-track hikes, especially the Stirling Ridge Walk, you've got goat trails going off everywhere because people forge their own path and then others follow that and that's not the right one, so they backtrack, and environmentally that's not great. So if everyone's on the same footpad, plants don't get disturbed, things like dieback aren't spread as easily, and it's also a good way to concentrate people into the areas that you want to. Yeah,
absolutely. I think sometimes there's a bit of pushback about when a trail becomes a trail and it's not just like an off-track route, in that, now it's becoming for everyone and you're dumbing it down. But sometimes places like, the West Arthurs has toilets and a much more formalized trail than it used to be. And that's not for people, that's for the environment.
Yeah.
And the Stirling Ridge, I think there'll be a lot of pushback from the BCA to actually manage the area as as an area there's a trail in it. But I can't see with the booming popularity of the trail that you can continue to manage it at the same level as a thing that sometimes people did, when people nowadays do it quite regularly.
Yeah, I agree. And the benefits of having trails, there is so many, and that's why they're so useful, is just as an activity to get people outdoors to connect with nature. Without them, I think most people would be pretty ambivalent to what's out there.
Yeah. I think, my mate, Ferrell, Kevin, shout out to Kevin, he often talks about this, is that, there's this sort of tension that nature exists in, where there's these places, if people don't see it, they don't care, and it will just become a mine or get logged.
Yeah.
You put in a trail, people care about it, and suddenly it just matters. And yes, there's maybe some loss by having a trail in there and keeping it wild, but the alternative sometimes is way worse than that.
Yeah, I think, if you show people something that's amazing, and an example is Karijini, is you've got trails there, people visit. I think if it was just a campground, people might not... they would still care, but maybe not as much. Whereas going into the gorges, seeing them, experiencing them, has made people care quite a lot about, hey, there might be more mining going through here. How about let's not do that? Because people remember their holiday from 10, 15, 20 years ago with great fondness, because of trails. And also economically, trails bring in business. So I know we've both gone to Tasmania several times over the last kind of 5 to 10 years, and each time we spend a bucket of money doing it because we enjoy hiking trails.
Yeah, I mean, just this weekend I'm going to Tasmania.
And just recently, DBCA didn't announce very well that they were upgrading Bald Head and the car park and the toilet facilities, and that was going to be closed. And lots of people are commenting like, I've planned my trip to Albany to do this trail. It's been on my list for a while. And that's just a big draw card to get people into regional areas that may not, attract them normally.
Absolutely. I mean, as much as I kind of feel, Bluff Knoll is sort of overrated, it's such a draw. People go just to climb Bluff Knoll. You can't underestimate that impact it has to draw people to there and then spend money in the area.
Yeah. Places like Walpole, if the Treetop Walk didn't exist, I'm not sure people would visit that area as much as they do.
Yeah.
Yeah, same with maybe Fitzgerald River is, yes, it's got some nice flora, but how are you going to see that flora?
Absolutely.
It's on trails.
Yeah.
So yeah, trails just endlessly beneficial to everyone, and we're big fans of trails.
You in fact have made some money from writing about trails.
But yes.
So there's a creates jobs.
It does. It allows me to buy my time back from my employer. So another thing we'd like to do with trails is do kind of like a discussion on 3 major trails. So 1 in WA and 2 in Tasmania that we've both walked. Very different trails, but also kind of the experience as what draws us to them is quite similar.
Absolutely, yeah. So the trails that we kind of talked about as ones that, because both of us have the experience of them, were the Cape to Cape, the Overland Track, and South Coast Track. And they're all sort of different trails. Both the South Coast Track and the Cape to Cape are coastal trails, but quite different coastal trails.
Yeah.
And the Overland and the South Coast Track are in Tassie, but they couldn't be more different,
Yeah. Well, let's start with the Tassie trails. So the Overland obviously has been recently upgraded. The huts, which you don't get on the South Coast Track, are somewhat extravagant now compared to what you'd experience pretty much anywhere in Australia.
Yeah.
And you compare that to the South Coast Track where you tent at every spot.
Yeah.
There's now an upgraded toilet, but it's still not deluxe.
Yeah. Before it used to be just a hatch in the ground, but now at least it's a proper toilet.
Yeah.
But that's as far as facilities go, whereas the Overland is like an extravagant. It's very much like a great walk, New Zealand style hut-based walk.
But the actual trails itself, I mean, the Overland's maybe a bit more curated in terms of there's things to see, there's more signage, there's a lot more boardwalk, even though the South Coast Track is getting upgraded. But it feels it is wilderness, but it doesn't feel like you're too far away from wilderness, if that makes sense, mainly because you've got the huts, and it's quite popular now that you're going to be spending it mostly with the same people, same 30 people for the whole week.
Yeah. I will say though, considering there's the infrastructure spend is much higher than the other 2 trails. When you climb up on top of a mountain, you don't see civilization. You just see nature. So it's quite interesting. And I think that's a real draw card to that trail, is that in spite of it being very infrastructure heavy, you do feel like there's no world beyond the trail when you're on the trail.
Yeah, I guess where I'm coming from with the infrastructure is it's more that at the end of each day, you have the comforts of home, of a dry place to sit and sleep. The ranger's there, so that's kind of like an external influence on the trail. There's helipads everywhere, and you're kind of in a communal space that feels more homely.
Yeah.
Whereas the South Coast Track, I mean, we're not particularly social people, but it took us until night 3, I think, 3 or 4, to really kind of explore who else was in camp and be a bit more social, whereas the Overland kind of forces you to introduce that into your trail experience.
Yeah. I do wonder, though, because you were by yourself, that kind of pushed you more. Because when I did the Cape to Cape recently, I was by myself, and I ended up talking to more people just because I was like, well, who else am I going to talk to? Whereas we had the 3 of us to talk to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess my Cape to Cape was a bit lonely in that sense because I only stayed in the 1 campsite, and the rest was in caravan parks. So I didn't really see too many people. But yeah, the Cape to Cape compared to the South Coast Track, obviously being in WA on that stretch of coastline, you're in and out of towns all the time. So that changes the experience a lot, but it's still enjoyable that when you're in nature, you're in nature.
It's amazing how, in spite of there being a world-class wine region and just towns upon towns along the coast, there is a lot of just very wild nature there still. And that's a really, I think, quite an amazing achievement to that walk. And I actually think in some ways the Cape to Cape and the Overland are quite similar in the sense that there's a very strong purpose behind your trip.
Yeah.
Because the overland, takes you from Ronnie Creek, which is Cradle Mountain,
Yeah.
to Lake St. Clair, and the Cape to Cape takes you from the Cape to the Cape, from Lewin to Naturalist, or Naturalist to Lewin, depending on which way you walk it.
Yeah.
Whereas the South Coast track felt a little bit less purposeful, even in spite of ironically being a more purposeful trail.
Yeah.
Because it was constructed for both mining purposes and for escape route for shipwreck.
I mean, it kind of does have that thing of, it's kind of the harbour to the southernmost road in Australia.
Yeah.
So it's just not as impactful as a giant lake and a giant mountain or two lighthouses.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the Cape to Cape does it well in terms of you don't really notice the towns. Most of them, except maybe Prevelly, you're in and out of town pretty quickly, and it's mainly through nature.
Yeah.
In and out. Like Gracetown's, you're rocky and then beaches and then straight back into dunes.
Yeah.
Whereas Prevelly's kind of in and out via a road.
And I think, we've you kind of alluded to it early on when we're talking about, other people, sometimes Western Australians are a bit of, basic bitches when it comes to, to things like, rapids. But I think we also take for granted how outstanding our beaches are. And, for a lot of people come to Western Australia, they might look at, Quinninup Falls and go, oh yeah, in Tasmania we've got better waterfalls.
Yeah.
But, I mean, as good as the South Coast track is, the beaches are better on the Cape to Cape.
Oh, yeah.
You know?
And I guess, while we're talking about these trails, is they are, the cream of the crop in terms of multi-day trails. And they are an experience. So it's something that people will fly to visit.
Yeah.
It's not just, a collection of random trails. It's the thought has gone into what goes into a nice trail experience.
Yeah.
That moves us on to our next point, which is kind of everyday trails versus destination trails.
Yeah.
So as we've just discussed, destination trails is ones that you really want to travel to because they're on a bucket list, or you've seen them in a book or whatever. And I'm looking at your list of trails that you want to do that you've written up, and they're all over Australia, and with good reason you travel to them.
Yeah.
Whereas your everyday trails are kind of, you have less expectation of them.
Absolutely. I this weekend just passed, I walked from the Camel Farm to Hewitt's Hill. The forest was very badly burnt from a recent prescribed burn. It was not particularly exciting. We saw a wallaby, which was nice. But, my expectations for that was that this is just a thing and Miles gets to play at the campsite.
Yeah.
But the time investment wasn't much. It was half an hour or 40 minutes driving there. We did this. We did some other things in the afternoon. It was just a fun, easy thing to do in the day.
Yeah.
Whereas, I'm going to the Freycinet circuit. I've had to plan ahead. I've got to book a car. I've got to book flights, accommodation. I'm thinking about whether or not I need to buy food or bring a stove, or am I going to go stoveless? These are considerations that sort of ramp up the longer the trail is. And the longer the trail is, the better it should be as well.
Yeah. I mean, no one's flying to Perth to do the Hill Street Walk or the Lesmurdie Falls walk trail. It's a nice to do if you're here. But I mean, destination trails don't always have to be the multi-day trails either. People
absolutely.
fly to Tasmania because they want to visit Mount Field National Park to do, the three waterfalls and the Tarn Shelf and trails like that. So they're going to an area because of trails, and they're good trails as well. Yeah,
I mean, Karijini is not a multi-day destination, but people, go all the way to the middle of the desert and spend a week there. Because the trails are outstanding and they're just day walks.
Yeah. I mean, same with, I mentioned earlier, Albany, it's got a reputation now of having good trails, so people obviously are going to go there expecting a good experience.
Yeah.
And I mean, they have plenty of everyday trails as well. There's the one going around the harbour, there's, Lake Seppings is there.
Yeah.
There's just Lots
But I
and
think,
lots.
you know, that if tourists are going to go to Albany, they're probably going to go do Bald Head. They're going to do Prongerups, Stirling Range. Maybe they'll do the Calgon River.
Yeah.
But then probably not doing Lake Sepix. You know, like that's for the people who live there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so also like a trail doesn't need to be nature based either. It can be an urban trail, and I mean it doesn't necessarily have to be marked either. Like you can walk around the river in Perth. That's not a marked trail, but it's a good trail experience.
Yeah.
They've built pavement there, and it takes you to some pretty cool places.
Yeah. I mean, Alyssa and I very regularly, like at least 5 to 10 times a year, will go to Kings Park and just walk a random loop around the botanical gardens because it's lovely.
And sometimes I find it, like with the urban walks especially, if they're marked and you're following a map, it's kind of a bit less enjoyable.
Yeah.
Because you're always referring to it, and it's kind of, like, I mean, especially when you go to Europe and you just kind of wander around and you've got places you want to see, but you could go 3 or 4 different directions, and it's fun just wandering around various streets and trails and pavements, and
I guess the key of what you're saying there is, like if you're just walking around town and it's like a way to fill an afternoon or a weekend, it doesn't really matter. Like the trail quality doesn't matter so much. If you live next door to the Channel 10 Tower Walk, you probably just do that for exercise, right? But if you're living in Sydney and you're coming to Perth, you're not going to come to do the Channel 10 Tower Walk.
not if you've listened to us talk about it.
So, I think the key here is if it's a destination trail, it better be bloody good. And I feel like a multi-day, why would you do an everyday multi-day? Unless you really just, maybe it's just something you just want to fill some time with. And I think that some recent sort of trail developments in WA have been sort of gearing more towards, like, I'm not sure what the purpose of the trail is, because when you walk it, you go, well, why am I here? Why are these sort of places important enough that they've been linked together as a trail? When we talk about the Cape to Cape Overland South Coast Track, I understand why the route goes that way, because it's interesting. Every day there's something that's different to see that was worthwhile my time. I'm happy to spend the money and go and do it and spend my annual leave time doing it. But, if the scenery is very sort of ho-hum, what's the point? Which I think is sort of an experience that you've had recently with some of those new trails.
Yeah, before I get on that, I think one factor in how I would judge, like if a multi-day trail was good, is if I get bad weather, am I still going to enjoy it?
Yeah, okay.
Whereas I think on a bad trail, if you get bad weather, it just kind of makes things much worse. Because like the Cape to Cape, I got on a couple of days, 80km/h winds and rain, sideways rain. Yeah, I still look back on that and be like, that was still fun. It was still good scenery. I can picture what it'd be like when it wasn't like that. It didn't detract. Whereas, the trail that I walked last year, the Wollman-Bilya, I got really bad weather, and it just kind of made things even worse compared to what they already were, which was based on the trail and the experience I'd had so far. So if you haven't listened to the last episode, basically the Wollman-Bilya is a 4 to 5 day multi-day trail that's around Collie, and it starts and finishes in Collie with 2 very long sections, so 10 to 12 kilometres of kind of getting out of town trail, and then it doesn't really take you to many interesting places along the way. So again, it comes down to why is it built, what are they trying to show you, and kind of the motives behind that, which may or may not be financially driven to try and get people in the area.
Yeah, so I think, there's very much this sense that, Collie has become the epicenter of trail development because there's, a very real fact that the mining industry is going to finish at some point. It's very clear that we're going towards renewables and coal is just not going to be financially viable. So they've created a lot of trails to kind of give it a destination to diversify their economy. And I think what they've done on the cycling side really works, because I think DVCA, which is, in WA, they really understand what makes a good cycling trail. And a good cycling trail can be through somewhat substandard scenery, because you're basically building a roller coaster. And as long as the roller coaster is good, you've been in roller coasters in parks where the scenery is not great, but it was fun.
Yeah.
And that's all that matters. And to be honest, even through regrowth Jarrah forest that's a bit scrappy and burnt, that's fun. You're not thinking about that. And I certainly feel that on the Munda Biddi. There's bits where if it was the bib, I would not be forgiving about its shortcomings.
Yeah.
Whereas I'm quite forgiving of it as a cyclist. And that really is a different experience to a hiker, where ho-hum scenery that's very repetitive becomes this is hours of my day.
Yeah, as you said, with cycling, if it's a 10-kilometre stretch, that's less than an hour. Whereas hiking, that's 3 hours, 2 to 3 hours of your life.
Yeah.
So you've got a lot more time to absorb the scenery, get a little bit annoyed if it's not great, be hopeful that it is ending soon. Yeah. So it's just one of those things that I guess that's kind of like bike trails versus hiking trails. You're expecting a different thing.
Yeah. And I think you have to keep that in mind when you build the trail. And I've had this discussion with Melina, who's, a trail runner, that there's a difference to the speed you're going dictates how much you're willing to put up with boring.
Yeah.
For example, leaving Northcliffe on the Munda Biddi, there's a very long, boring ride of vehicle track riding. And it goes for a very long time. If that had been walking, that would be 3 days. But it's half a day, or, maybe a quarter of a day. And, I'll wear it. It's okay, because based on everything else, I understand.
Yeah.
But 3 days of a 7-day hike would be unacceptable.
Yeah, and you get that with the Wilmanbilla is, I think, they were we'll put the campsites here, they're on the Wellington Dam, that will be the big draw card.
Yeah.
Whereas to get there, there's a lot of ho-hum walking, and it doesn't make up for what is there.
Yeah. I feel like that's something that is symptomatic of, I guess, the thinking in WA versus maybe some other states. WA, our campsites are much better than over east. You look at the Bibbulmun track. You look at other trails like the one in Le Sueur, the overnight there. The campsite's way better than what you get in Queensland or New South Wales, where they'll be here's a water tank and here's a toilet, nothing else.
Yeah.
And then the question there for me is well, are you selling a hiking experience or a camping experience? And there's merits to both, but if I'm spending 8 hours of my day through boring scenery, was it worth the trip, or should I just have driven to multiple, campsites?
Yeah.
Because that's the options, of how I spend my time.
And I suppose going back to the Overland and the South Coast track, they're selling a hiking experience, and that's reflected in the pricing, as you just need your parks pass. And obviously there's the cost of the flight getting in and out. But the Overland is they've identified that as, hey, here's some good camping facilities and a good trail. Here's the price to reflect that.
Yeah.
Which we can't do that in WA for a variety of reasons, mainly access. But I think people are willing to pay for that kind of great experience. But WA seems to be well focused on, here's an allotment of money, and 80% of that will go into building stuff rather than the actual trail being built properly.
Yeah, I think in Tassie there's an understanding that there's OPEX as well as CAPEX, whereas here it's CAPEX, there's no OPEX because volunteers will maintain the trail.
Yeah.
Say the Fitzgerald River trail that they were going to build through the middle that never got made because it couldn't pass the EPA. maybe that would have been possible had they had rangers at every campsite. You'd have to pay people to do that. But maybe that could have been achievable if you charged people for it. And I think people would have paid because Fitzgerald River's freaking amazing.
Yeah.
And people would, people from over east come here and they're like, holy crap, the biodiversity here is like visible. You can literally see it. So they missed an opportunity, I feel, to do something that maybe would have cost a bit more and there would have been an OPEX expense. They just looked at the OPEX expense and went, oh, I guess that's probably too hard.
Yeah. And I guess, that's kind of, it would be a similar Tassie Trail experience in that there's no access in and out. So it would feel remote and wildernessy.
Yeah.
That's even a word. And like, it's one of those things, if you want a good trail experience, like most hikers won't really balk at the price of a hike. Like if you want to do the overland, that's just what it costs. And as long as it's not an outrageous increase every year.
I think that you're right. If it's a public hut price.
Yeah.
I think like spending $2,500, I'd balk at that price for a private luxury lodge.
Wine and cheese hike.
Yeah. I couldn't do that every quarter the way that I like to do that. Whereas I could, in most cases I can kind of afford to do every quarter or maybe twice a year a multi-day somewhere in Australia that has a reasonable, modest price.
So if a parks department or a shire or a private company decided to actually put money into the facilities, do they actually matter in terms of the trail experience? I guess kind of it depends on like what type of hiker you are.
Yeah.
But I would say if the scenery is good enough, no.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that I prefer that there's a toilet. I really do prefer that there's a toilet because I know what to do in the bush, but I prefer not to do it. So having a toilet facility is fine. Having water is probably good if you're in a dry area like Western Australia. In Tasmania, they don't have to worry because there's creeks everywhere. But those things are really important. Anything else beyond that is just cream on top of the cake. It's a cherry on top.
I mean, I didn't really use the Wilman-Bilya facilities. Like they built like a shelter and it had tables and everything, but to me that wasn't necessary. I camped anyway because you couldn't camp in those facilities, so I kind of thought, what's the point of them?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the bare minimum, as you said, is a toilet and maybe water, depending on where you are.
Yeah.
I'm not too fussed on whether there is excellent facilities. It was certainly an added bonus on the overland, but are they necessary? I don't think so. No,
I think would people enjoy the overland still if there were no facilities? Probably. I think the facilities, if we were to do a winter overland where you might die, if there was no huts, sure, the facilities would really matter a lot more, I think. But for a summer overland where the weather's, sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's not so bad, yeah, probably, who cares? Like a tent site's probably fine.
Yeah. I think we're probably living in a world now where extravagant spend on facilities is tending to be the norm. Like you look at the Grampians Peak Trail that's just been built, and they put a lot of money into not only the facilities themselves, but also the design and kind of the architectural elements that, that's great and you appreciate them, but are they really necessary? They've probably gone a bit over the top with that.
Yeah, I think when you're putting sort of millions of dollars into the design of a toilet, sure, go for your life, but that's not the reason that we go to these places. Would I have gone to, the overland if the toilets were just ordinary toilets? yeah, of course I would have, you know. Um,
On that though, there's a noticeable difference between the old style and the new style ones.
oh yeah, I mean the toilets are very deluxe. I love the ones where you go up the stairs to the, you know.
Yeah, they're great, but the ones towards the southern end of the track, yeah, not the most enjoyable experience.
Yeah. And look, I'm not against huts, because you know there are some people who are like, if you build a hut on a trail, you know, particularly I think in like Victoria, there's this very sensitive, you know, like if you're going to build a hut, they'll flip the table and enrage at the thought of you dumbing down the experience that way, and I don't necessarily care about that. Like, I mean, coming from Western Australia, where the Bibbulmun has shelters at every campsite, I'm very used to the idea of that.
Yeah.
And I think that for beginners, it's a really great way to entice them to do it. So I don't have the same like, oh, that's dumbing down the experience sort of feeling about it.
And even with the Bib recently over the last couple of years where they're upgrading campsites, I don't think they've gone over the top with them.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
just catering to the increased numbers that are visiting the track. So
Yeah,
not like they're replacing the whole thing with, you know,
a luxury lodge.
luxury lodge, or even like the Helena campsite style where it's just bigger with more bunks. They're just kind of tinkering here and there, and it's still like the essence of the Bibbulmun is intact.
Absolutely, yeah.
In terms of facilities and infrastructure, signage is also a big part of a trail. So sometimes I was thinking about this when I was there's a new trail out at Dwelling Up that was okay, but there was a nice section of single trail that they just built. And I was walking through it and I was wondering, like, why do I enjoy this so much? And it was the absence of anything. Like, there's trail markers there, but you're just there to enjoy the trail. There's no over-the-top, like, information boards or, you know, look over here to see this, or, like, I don't know. There was just something about it where it's just a bit more pure. And I guess there are trails that do rely on interpretive signage a lot more than others. But I wouldn't want to do like an overland track or a Cape to Cape where there's an information board every kilometre telling me about, like, here's a view or here's a plant or whatever. It's like I can probably read up on that in a guidebook if I want to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they get it right on the Cape to Cape. Like, you know, like Mikadarabi Falls, they've got, you know, the Aboriginal dreaming story there. Fantastic. That's great. But you're right. Like, if every, you know, like kilometer or every, you know, like 100 meters, there's an interpretive sign, that's probably a bit much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in terms of like less signage, I guess some trails there's only one way to go, but especially when there's multiple options, sometimes it's not great if you have to be constantly looking at a GPS to figure out where you are and which turn to take. It's nice just to say, oh, here's my trail marker, I'm going that way, or, you know, you've got an intersection where there's a board saying go here, go there.
Yeah.
There's certainly a lot of anxiety if you're looking for a trail marker and you haven't seen one for a while.
Yeah. And I think you're right. Like, you know, like with the South Coast track, did we see trail markers regularly? Probably not. Did it matter? Probably not, because it's the only trail for most of the way. There's some bits where sometimes there's a junction, but mostly it's just the only trail. But on a trail, like a lot of the WA trails that are particularly off the Bibbulmun, the Bibbulmun itself, there's a lot of vehicle track walking where there's junctions and stuff like that, and you could very easily just mistakenly just keep walking.
Yeah.
In that case, signage really matters, and I think that's something that you found with this new trail, is that the marker color is a little bit not easy to read.
Yeah, like I think they made a decision before they realised, and they had them all made up, because when they were installing them, especially the darker trees, they've like scratched away at the bark so it's lighter, and then put it on.
Okay.
But I mean, if you know what you're looking out for, it's not too much of an issue. It's just kind of funny that they selected a tangerine colour that's quite dark.
Yeah.
When I know the Bibbulmun track would have preferred something different. So, I mean, we've talked about trails and they do come in many forms. Obviously, you've got your one-way trails, which can be return trails. You got your circuits, your networks, what they've referred to as lollipop trails, which I think we sometimes refer to as tadpole trails, where it's kind of an out and back with a loop, or a loop with an out and back, whichever way. Do you have a preference for a trail that you enjoy?
I mean, look, I think recently I've realized that there's some problems with some of these. Particularly I think we're seeing some issues in WA with these loop trails are being built for convenience purpose, but the quality of what you're seeing is not worth the loop. Like, you might as well just walk there and back. But then conversely, as a tourist, I was looking at doing the Gurry Great Walk on Gurry Island in Queensland, and I found the logistics of it being a one-way trail just terribly difficult and very expensive. And some of the other great walks in Queensland again have the same problem, that it's very logistically challenging. The Scenic Rim Trail, it's like you have to drive 3 hours between the two places. You better have a very good friend in Brisbane who's going to be prepared to drop you off at one end and pick you up the other end. If you are from WA and going there, you don't really know people there well enough to get you to do that. That's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. And that's a real problem for that trail. And it means just immediately you lose a market unless you can get tour operators to do the work. And unfortunately, unless it's a very busy area, it's really hard to get the people to do that. In Tasmania, it's maybe a little bit less challenging. But even then, like, if you're doing the overland, there's buses and coaches that take you to either end, so it's fine. But if you were to do, say, Walls of Jerusalem, and Walls of Jerusalem wasn't a circuit, I think that would be more challenging to get someone to pick you up at the end or to have a car,
I mean, it exists as companies. I think Tassie's probably one of the best states for it.
Absolutely.
But it is something you need to, or not the individual hiker, but when they're planning a trail, is they need to think about these things. Like, is it in an area where someone can profitably run a transport business? Which I think somewhere like Fitzgerald River, that would be an issue if they had a one-way trail going there. And that's a long drive to get from one end to the other too.
And I think that, with the Three Capes, they've worked that out quite well in that they've gone, well, there's a bus, and the bus is part of the fare. Like, we charge you for this, but we also operate the bus that will take you back to the start.
Yeah.
That's fine. I think if you're going to build a trail and invest the money in it, and it's going to be logistically challenging, if you want that return for investment, sometimes you have to spend a bit of money.
Yeah. And I guess, like, if you're planning a trip, you kind of, know what you're getting into. Although with your Gurry walk, you're finding it a bit annoying to try and organise that.
I literally changed my plans because it was just too annoying. It was, the taxi on the island was going to cost me way too much. The tidal issue of, like, when to get across and stuff like that, too difficult. It just was logistically just not... It was going to cost me extra days to save money. And people don't want that. People will just not do the trail as I have it. I've just gone, I'll do it another time when I have other people who can share the load of the cost.
So I guess where we're going with that is, like, if it's beneficial or if, like, the scenery is outstanding and you can do a one-way trail, I think that's probably the preferred option. Circuit trails are great for single-day hikes or short trails. I think probably the preferred option there as well, because you get to see more. As much as I enjoy return trails, because you see it from a different perspective, it is nice to do a longer or the same distance but get to see more on a circuit trail.
Yeah, absolutely.
And kind of networks. I'm not really sold on trail networks.
Nah, neither. I mean, I think for example, Mount Martin Reserve suffers a little bit by being not a true, like, it's a network. And so it's a bit of a choose your own adventure. and you feel like it's less of a thing than a trail that was like, this is the curated experience. This is what you do.
Yeah. So my thing with networks is, it's great you can choose where you want to go, but some of them are like loops off loops, and you're like, well, then I'm going to miss out on that bit. What if I want to see that bit? And the one that I found particularly annoying was in Nipmuc National Park in the Northern Territory. It was a nice network, but you had to hike the same section, which was like 3 or 4 kilometers each time you wanted to get out to a new bit of trail.
Yeah.
Which in the heat of the Northern Territory is not fun.
Yeah.
And like the entry or the start of the trail to get out there was mainly vehicle tracks, like up a hill, which I guess you would have had to have done anyway. But it was just kind of like, oh, this section of the trail isn't, like, I'm doing it 3-4 times to do all these other different sections.
Yeah.
Which is fine if you're on a bike, but when you're on a hike, not so great.
Yeah, and I feel like, so with a hike, it's different on a hike to a bike, because when you're on a bike and you're at a trail network, it's basically like going to an amusement park and picking which roller coaster you're going to go on, and you understand that you have to walk between the roller coasters. So the trail is functional, the bits in between.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're doing a hike, I feel like you're not going on a roller coaster, and you're not going to different amusement park rides.
Yeah, there's the thing with like the mountain bike trail networks is, if you're not on like the good trail, it's a linking trail, and you can, like, if you're with friends, you can like talk about what you've just done and like all the cool sections, or you can just take it easier to recover. Whereas hiking, like, you're going the same speed, so like, why would I walk an extra kilometer to link up with another trail that's, you know, I don't know. It's just, yeah. I think it works for biking, not so much for hiking.
Absolutely, yeah. I think if you're trying to build a hiking network, it just becomes too muddy. It's like, well, you're not curated an experience. You've just said, well, there's all these different trails. And that's kind of like just walking in the suburbs or a road, you know. Like it's just functional places to go, rather than it being, you're going to places that are worthwhile.
Yeah. I mean, having said all that, for my daily dog walks, I love mixing it up in the streets and going different routes and stuff, but that's not like, I'm not traveling somewhere and looking at a trailhead and going, oh, which way do I want to go out of, 20 different options.
Yeah. I mean, conversely, there are people who do, the overland, and they'll walk to Walls of Jerusalem through like some back trails.
Yeah.
And there's like a bit of adventure to it. So, I can see some value in a network in some sense, but I mean, when you think about the majority of people, are they doing the Walls of Jerusalem circuit and the overland track, or are they doing the overland via the walls? Probably not many people are doing the overland via the walls.
Yeah. I think where a network kind of can be acceptable for hiking is if you have, here's a long trail, but here's also a shorter option to cut off, half the distance or a quarter of the distance or whatever.
Yeah.
So if you don't want to do 16, 20 kilometers in a day, you can do 4 to 10 or something like that.
Like the Little Eagle Trail.
Little Eagle Trail, yes.
Yeah. Which is really just a rebrand of the old Christmas Street Trail.
Yeah.
Trail.
Here's a trail we built, but also we're taking one away.
Yeah. Yeah.
So another thing, apart from the physical trail, is you mentioned it earlier, Donovan, is the extrinsic values. So take the overland, for example. I had a lady who was in the same traveling party as me. She's like, well, you've hiked a lot. What are some of the trails that are exactly like this, in terms of there's a hut at the end of each day and everyone's very social? And I was racking my brain. I was just like, I really can't think of too many where you're going to get 30 people of different backgrounds and from all over the world and Australia where you would meet like that. I mean, you kind of get it on the bib, but it's very small.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that, to her, really made a fantastic trail experience. And for me as well, I think back on the Munda Biddy and the Billman sections I've done, is the people really make the experience, and sometimes the weather and the time of year, and that all goes into the trail experience and what makes a fun trail.
Yeah.
I think you kind of get that on the PCT as well, whereas it's kind of like a culture around the trail.
Absolutely. I think I felt that on the New Zealand Great Walks I've done, particularly less so on Tongariro Circuit, but definitely on the Abel Tasman Trail, because that you're on there for a long time and you're with the same group for a long time. So that definitely had a sense of like this is a trail community. Longer trails, I think, definitely get that if the trail has enough people doing it. So Bibbulmun's popular enough that you get people, so you'll get to become friends with the people you're hiking with. But yeah, it's a really hard thing. I mean, and I guess this is a key thing. Is like, you know, we're talking about a lot of the stuff we've talked about is the intrinsic qualities of the trail. Is it worthy of my time to see the scenery? But there are people out there who go, well, that's not important to me. All that's important to me is distance. There might be like, you know, sort of the challenge hikers who are like, I want to do 200 kilometers in a weekend. I'm going to barely sleep. And there are people who go there and they want to make friends. They want to talk to people. And that's something that I think a good trail has that almost automatically if it's intrinsically good. Because you see the photo of Cradle Mountain and you go, oh, I want to do that trail. I don't know many trails that are intrinsically bad that have extrinsically good qualities.
Yeah. I mean, not to hate on South Australia, but I don't think people are going, oh, yeah, the Hyson Trail. I'm going to do that one because of the people. And because I don't think there's that many people would do that to kind of get the level of, you know, social interaction that like the Overland or the Bib would have.
Yeah, and look, the Bib has a lot of problems. There's a lot of things I go, oh, this is not up to standard versus the Overland. But it's also 1,000 kilometers. The Overland's only 65 Ks. So I can kind of forgive some of those problems. And I think most people can, because like the experience of walking on a trail like the Bibbulmun or the PCT. I mean, I've seen videos of the PCT where you know, for days you're walking through burnt out scenery. So those problems exist, whether it's, you know, if it's a long trail, those problems are definitely going to be there because there's going to be some section that's crap.
I guess the PCT is probably one of the ones you could say there are long stretches where the trail is like objectively terrible, where you're walking through desert in, you know, 35-degree heat and you're not going to come across water that may be clean. But people come away from that saying, oh, my trail family was amazing.
Yeah.
And this is like the fun experience I had with those people. Or like someone would come into your life for a week and then be on a different schedule and then you'd never see them again, but you'd kind of remember the impact that they left.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I kind of found that on the Munda Biddi, like compared to the Bibbulmun, is we're at Donnelly River, and although I'd been with Aaron for the whole time, it was nice to be around other people because they were on the Bib, whereas the numbers on the Munda Biddi weren't there. We're in a campsite on our own, or if you're in town, obviously there's lots of people there, but you don't know them. They're not doing the same thing as you.
Yeah.
It's a bit different. So that was, yeah. I think as the Munda Biddi becomes a bit more popular, that may change. But that's one of the draw cards, I think, certainly of something like the Bib or the Overland or something, is that social factor.
Yeah, and there's people from the Bibbulmun that I've met randomly who I've caught up with years later. You know, like I've thought, you know, I'm in town, let's catch up.
Yeah.
Whereas there's other trails I've done where scenically were better, and I've not caught up with anyone from that hiking experience. It just is, you know, and I think a key thing here in what we're talking about, I think, yes, the intrinsic factors matter there to the experience, but sometimes with like long trails, and it's something that I guess I kind of, for a long time with like the Bib, you know, people have heard me be critical of sections of the Bib, but for people who are doing long trails, they're a different type of hiker. I think people who are through hiking a 3,000 kilometer trail, they have something different that they're looking for in a hike. They're not just spending their annual leave time doing a hike the way I am. they're taking 3 months of their life out to do this thing.
Yeah.
And I think there's a spiritual quality to it that's maybe a bit more important to the scenery when you're just like plodding along for such a long period of time.
Yeah, I get what you mean. Like you come across the end-to-enders on the bib, and there's just something different about them. And like if you come across one or a couple of them that have been together for a while, like there's just that click that they have.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, you get that on the bib. Like you have people doing overnighters, day walks, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But as mainly a solo hiker, I was looking forward to the social aspect of the overland, but also I really wanted just to walk on my own each day. And even though like I'd kind of like attached myself to a few people and especially one family, like it was nice to walk alone during the day, knowing that they were around and I might run into them.
Yeah.
But this was still my journey and I wanted to experience it on my own.
And I think that's the great thing about the overland, because they limit the numbers, is you can walk by yourself. It's not feeling like it's so crowded that even if you were to go by yourself, that you would be in a group of 20 people.
Yeah. And you like some of the fun parts were like you'd been hiking alone all day and you'd come across like a waterfall or a swimming spot and there'd be heaps of people there and you'd like have some chill time with them and socialize. But then people would just go off on their own and depart when they wanted to. There was no kind of like, oh, we have to hike together today and talk all the time. It was just, I'll see you at camp.
Absolutely. Like when we did it, I remember there was a family that we were at, we were quite social with, and there were two friends from Singapore, and these are the people we probably talked to the most. We never hiked with them, except for doing Mount Ossa. We sort of teamed up with a few of these people. But otherwise, Alyssa and I, we get up super early. We're the first out of camp. We had the trail to ourselves, basically. And that really, I think, added to the experience of being able to feel like we had the trail and nature to ourselves. And then at camp, have the social aspect. We also did have an angry German man. So there was that.
Yeah. I guess to finish up, like what attracts you to trails? Like why trails? Why have you dedicated a good portion of your adult life and like little Donnie's life to trails and seeking them out, and like it's a big part of your life?
I guess I said it in the last episode. I said, I really want to look back on my life and be able to say, I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. We all have a limited amount of time on Earth, and whether you believe in afterlife or reincarnation or nothing, that time that we have, regardless of what it is still finite. If it's that we go on to something else, still this time is finite. If we go on to nothing, it's extremely finite. And I just want to look back on it and say, well, I saw a lot of things, particularly in a time of climate change, where things are going away. We have limited time to see things. So I really want to see as much in the lifetime that I have. So it really matters to me. The time I take out from my work is really quality. If it's not about spending 5 days in a forest that is substandard. So I'm sorry, but like a trail like the Willimanbilya is not for me. I understand that it might be for some people who just need 5 days to take their time out from the world, but you can have that time out from the world on a good trail as well.
There's better trails for that.
Yeah, so that's why I hike really for the aesthetic qualities. That really matters to me, and trails that are just to spend time, well, I don't have much time. That's how I feel. How about you?
I mean, much the same in terms of, like I just enjoy doing it. And I think there's something deep down that I'm starting to realize, or I've probably realized it for a while now, is that when I don't get out into nature, like it really affects my mood and how I'm feeling. And it's one of those things that, like, if you spent 2-3 weeks where you haven't gone out and experienced just a calm or a quiet or looking at nature, I think it's hardwired into us that we need those things.
Yeah.
And trails provide that quite easily. Like, yes, I could just go wander a random section of bush, and as I get older, that's probably more what I want to do anyway. But with trails, it allows you just to, like, reset, focus on nothing but, you know, you're walking or you're biking. And as I get older, that, like, I crave that a lot more. And having just spent the long weekend in Prevelly, part of it was I don't just want to go there, be at camp, maybe do a few touristy things. Like, I want to just get out and do something. And thankfully my mum started walking a lot more, so I'm like, right, I'll show her bits of the Cape to Cape and we'll do that, which I probably would have done anyway, just as to get out and see stuff. And I think trails provide that opportunity a lot more than just driving around.
Yeah. I think that's the key thing of what we've been talking about the trail experience, is that you can drive from, like, site to site to site, but if you're going to just walk from site to site to site along where you could drive, that's not exciting. The destination has to be worthy of the journey.
Yeah, and, like, on that, it's funny when you're down south on a holiday and you drive from, like, Walpole to Denmark and it takes you an hour, and you think back, that was a week of my life and how enriching that was.
Yeah.
And that's what trails provide you.
Absolutely, yeah.
So yeah, that's why I enjoy it. And, like, it's really hard to explain to some people. Like, they just think, oh yeah, I drive out to somewhere and they're at a place and it's like, you know, it's okay. But it's like, try walking there on a trail and, like, really focusing on what's there and everything around you, and it's a completely different experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
As well. Plus the social aspect as well. Like, you get to meet some great people out hiking. You're generally of the same mindset. Particularly the older hikers are great because they've probably got fantastic life experience and they're more than happy to share it.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, you're in a cafe with someone, they're not really going to be willing to share too much. Whereas you're out on the trail, they're probably going to be more open.
Yeah. I think, you know, there's a certain type of person who does hiking, multi-day trails in particular. And when you meet those people, regardless of age, they're always interesting people. Except for the really weirdos.
They can be interesting
but
as well.
they can be interesting, but they can also be a bit scary. But yes, you know, I think it's always something that's... I think when you meet people on the trail who are like-minded people, and particularly, as you say, older people seem to be more open to talking. I don't know what it is. I think when you get old, you just don't give a care, you know, about...
Yeah, or, like, I don't know. You're more willing to find out about other people's journeys, and, like, it's not necessarily about you all the time.
Yeah.
And also, like, taking out, like, my nieces on the trail, like, it's seeing trails from a different perspective.
Oh, absolutely.
Is, like, will they enjoy what I enjoy, or, you know, showing them, you know, a flower or a tree, or, you know, the way something works, and, like, you see it in their mind, they're like, wow, this is fascinating. You're like, yeah, I found that fascinating as well. And, like, yeah, it's that love of the trails and the environment that I love seeing in different people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, taking Miles to Hewitt's Hill and seeing him just love... you know, we took him out of the pack, probably about, like, half a kilometer away from the hut, and it was the longest half an hour of my life.
Yeah.
But I was fine with it because he got so much out of that time, you know. And when we got to the campsite and there were the logs, he was climbing over the logs, and he, you know, I took a bit of video of it, and he was just loving it so much. And that, you know, I think giving back and giving to someone else, particularly younger people, you really get something out of that experience that you don't get just out of just doing it yourself.
Yeah. Did he see the moon at Hewitt's Hill?
No, he didn't. But we went to SciTech and we went to the planetarium, and when the moon appeared in the video, he gasped.
I know that place.
Yeah,
Moon.
so I can imagine one day we're going to do a trail in like a, like a really dark place like Karajini, or like when I did the northern circuit of Tongariro, there was one night where I was like, wow, the sky is amazing. He's going to go like, wow. And that would be lovely.
I look forward in like 15, 20 years of going on hikes with him and just like annoying him by going like moon.
Yeah.
So yeah, trails. I think you would have realized by now we really enjoy trails.
Real trail talk wouldn't exist if we didn't love trails, Mark.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess like you do have to experience the good with the bad, and you'd hope that most of the trails are good, and it's not always the case, but yeah, well, I think we tried to explain what we enjoy about them and what makes a good trail.
Yeah. And because I've gone the whole episode and I didn't say it, I'm just going to say Marin Road, and that's that.
Yeah, best trail in the world.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode or any other episode of Real Trail Talk, then please rate us on whatever platform you're currently listening to us on. Ratings really help us to reach an audience, especially those who are looking to learn about the outdoors in Western Australia and Australia in general. If you had any questions or suggestions for future episodes, you can email us at realtrailtalk@gmail.com or contact us through our social media channels. Thanks again, and stay tuned for our next episode.